Thank you so much, Edward. Thank you so much for being here. It's wonderful to see such a big group of people coming to hear about the world of net zero in the supply chain. I'm Alexandra Hammond. I'm head of sustainable procurement and supply chain for the NHS, so the National Health Service in England. And we have recently put a huge amount of investment into working with our suppliers to deliver net zero. So it's quite an exciting world of supplier engagement and sustainability. Ooh, thank you so much. I'm joined today by an expert panel of professionals who work in this area, Lazar Armianov, Myles and Nico Ross, who will be introducing themselves in just a moment. Just to let you know, we'll be taking questions via Slido. So on your devices, if you go to sli.do and look up SUS Week, you'll be able to and put any questions you have for the panel into Slido. So please do get involved with that if you can. And we will make sure we have time at the end for some questions. But if I can just kick off with an introduction to our panel. I'll start with Lazar here. Lazar, can you just tell us a little bit about who you are, what your involvement is with net zero and suppliers, and tell us a little bit about what you think are some of the biggest challenges of working with suppliers in the net zero space?
Thanks, Alex, and hello, everyone. Thanks for having us today. I'm Lazar. I work for EcoVadis. I'm the regional director for Northern Europe. And part of what the company does is give visibility on the sort of sustainability performance of organizations based on evidence. Part of that looks obviously at carbon, their commitments, the action that they're taking, and sort of the reporting and the results that they're achieving in exactly that space. And we've done some research over the last 2-3 years to look specifically at carbon in the supply chain. What are the capabilities of organizations? What can they actually do? And found out that although everybody wants the holy grail, wants to be able to report solid carbon emissions, less than sort of 15, even 10% of organizations are in that, well, let's say, have those capabilities. Most, if you even go in some parts of the world, carbon is still a new term for them. So starting to talk to these about net zero isn't really going to work. So a lot of what we're trying to do and advising organizations to do is to start the dialogue with such organizations, with the smaller suppliers. The vast majority of companies' supply chains will be SMEs, and therefore it's about educating these organizations on that topic. What does carbon actually mean? What is an electricity bill in some parts of the world? For many, it will be very difficult to even get that. And so it really is about understanding exactly where they are on that, let's call it journey. A lot of people like to use that word. I'm not the biggest fan, but let's start with that. And start to sort of engage with them, not just on the topic, but start to see what are the small changes they can make to get to a stage where they understand what carbon is, where they understand what Scope 1 and 2 represent, how they can get that data. Will they need to, estimate a lot of it, or will they need to, put things in place to get to primary data in order to then look at what are the things that they can change to reduce carbon, get to net zero, and help the organizations that are requesting that data get to net zero as well. So a lot of it is indeed about education and engagement. You've even seen in SBTI that there is now a target about engagement. That's really what the focus should be on in order to get to proper data.
Brilliant. That's really helpful to hear, because I think those of us working in sustainability and supply chains can often live in a bubble of feeling that everybody understands what we're talking about, but actually making it real for people is really incredibly important.
Yeah.
Myles, can I move to you? If you could just introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about what you think are the key things you think suppliers should be doing to get to this net zero agenda.
Sure. Well, I'm slightly out of place here because I'm a physicist. And so I'm even more in a bubble. I'm in an ivory tower, not just a bubble. So 17 years ago, I gave a talk in which I reported with a colleague, Dave Frame, that actually 50 to 80% reductions in CO2 emissions probably wasn't going to be enough to stop global warming, and actually we had to get to net zero. And I've been dealing with the implications ever since. And it seemed quite simple back then. we just had to stop dumping carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. It's got a lot more complicated, particularly in the past few years, as more and more players have started to grapple with this challenge. And I think one of the things I can do as a physicist is to remind you of the old physics adage, everything should be made as simple as possible, but not simpler. And in the end, to stop global warming, we need to decarbonize 4 products: oil, gas, coal, and cement. Basically, if we do that, what I mean by decarbonizing those products is ensure that 1 ton of carbon dioxide is safely and permanently disposed of, which means re-injected back into the Earth's crust, for every ton released by the continued use of those products. We've got 30 years to do that if we want to meet the goals of the Paris Climate Agreement. So we need to increase the fraction that we stick back underground by 3.3% per year for the next 30 years. Job done, on average. Okay? Now, it's currently 0.1% and flat. So, job difficult, okay? But job pretty simple. And what I worry about is the amount of energy that is currently being addressed, sort of washing around this problem without necessarily drilling right in on the core fundamentals. Because, lots of people will say, but there's so much more to the climate issue than just those 4 products. Yes, but those 4 products are 80 or 90% of it. And that's where I'm concerned that we can easily get lost in the challenges of counting our carbon without realizing that in the end, if we're still using any of those products and the supplier of those products hasn't dealt with the CO2 that they generate, and if we aren't dealing with it for them either, then we've still got a problem. So I just urge you all to think about the products that matter and focus on them. And it worries me that in many cases, the oil and gas industry in particular is kind of left out of the conversation about supply chains because that's just too difficult. But that's what matters. They've got to be part of the solution. And if we all started using carbon neutral fuels, meaning requiring the suppliers to neutralize their climate impact before we even bought them, we wouldn't have a climate problem.
Food for thought. Thanks, Myles. I think it's really interesting to think about how we can get very complicated. This project and problem is so complex, but boiling it down to those 4 areas is...
It's very big because oil, gas, coal, and cement are everywhere.
Yeah.
But it's not that complicated. We're taking carbon out of the ground and dumping it in the atmosphere. We've got to stop doing that. That's it, okay? We either stop taking it out or we start putting it back at the same rate we're taking it out. End of story.
Simple. Nico.
Now you can tell us how we can do it.
Yeah. It's great after all that.
Yeah. Nico, you work work with suppliers. You are a supplier.
Yeah.
You work in an area that close to my heart around pharmaceuticals.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit about what you think are some of the opportunities for suppliers to engage with this?
Yeah. It's tough after his speech. Yes, I think the basic concept. So we work. We are supplied to pharmaceuticals. So we give them the hardware, software, and the service to distribute pharma globally, mainly by air freight. That means we are a big consumer of fuel.
Yeah.
But probably to this later. So I think that's our main pollution is that we use fuels. To the opportunities, I think if you look at the supply chain, so what we can do, I think we have to think about 3 elements. So we have waste from packaging, which is significant, especially let's say in temperature controlled packaging. Those are styrofoam boxes, which take a huge amount of space and volume and oil to produce them. This is one aspect. The other aspect is we can bring down the volume of transport itself and also the mileage. because then we don't need fuel at all. And of course, the last part is that we bring transport itself to net zero, which we have to do. To the first part, I think the first part is, in my view, the easiest. Because instead of just using throwaway packaging, use reusable or multi-use packaging. This has several positive impacts. One positive impact, of course, you don't generate waste. That's obvious. But also because if you have a multi-use packaging, it can be more expensive because you can amortize it over several usages. I mean, it can be more efficient. It can be more volume efficient. So you cut already a lot of transportation away, so which leads me to the second point. So with packaging already helps to reduce the amount of transport. At the moment, we don't. If you look around, it's still a lot of packaging is just thrown away and very bulky and so on. The second part of transportation, I think, the high potential, so on the positive side, is the digitalization, which comes in. Because at the moment, each supplier, also we ourselves, we look at our supply chains. We look how we transport goods for our pharmaceuticals, how we send them around globally. Often we have half-empty trucks flying around, sometimes half-empty planes. Because the complexity to coordinate with all others is very complex. But I think digitalization will help that a lot. That one brings down again complexity, that many companies can work together to get a higher utilizations out of trucks and out of airplanes, which at the end pollute. And I think to the last point, I'm completely aligned with Alan. I think the technology is already there. Also for aircraft, sustainable fuels are invented, so we don't need to invent something. We just need to use them for airplanes. And I think we have there to distinguish between long distance travel and short distance travel. I think short distance travel, in my view, the most efficient way is go on electric trucks, go on electric airplanes, because there you can use directly the sun power with very few losses. And for long distance travel, in the midterm, at least, we need fuels with a very high energy density. But there we have to look that we can use more sustainable fuels, that people are willing to pay for it, or that we at the end, the suppliers, get the money that we can pay for sustainable fuels.
And one of the areas that must be a challenge for you is the temperature with which drugs need to be transported. I mean, presumably the cooling element of transportation of drugs is another challenge.
Let's say that's mainly part of packaging. So traditionally, it's done with throwaway solutions, so a big styrofoam box, and if you have bad luck with ice in it, and that's then part of the medicine also gets destroyed, and you have to reproduce. You generate them there because often, let's say, that's a general problem with big corporates. They think in silos. So the silo who purchased the packaging is not the silo who produces then the medicine. So if they lose the medicine because they buy cheaper packaging, they don't care. They bought cheap packaging, and the silo who is for production, they produce more, but that's another bill. So I think also there digitalization helps. That also corporates like pharma companies have a better overview of actually what is the impact if they use a cheap throwaway compared there are other solutions. So we produce containers, we multi-use, and we pool globally. It works. Also, we do smaller packaging, which we pool globally, which also is working. So it's not that the technology is not there. It's just one needs to use them and to scale it.
Myles, how do we square up your very simple approach to this complex problem of these four elements with the challenge that Lazar has with having conversations with individual companies and suppliers about what they're going to do, what contribution they're going to have?
Well, I think, clearly every supplier has a role to play in reducing, but certain suppliers are kind of special because they're providing precisely the product that's causing the problem. And those are suppliers who I believe companies should all be piling the pressure on. What's your plan for decarbonizing the fuel you're selling me? They could produce synthetic drop-in fuels, or they could just take the carbon dioxide back out of the atmosphere and dispose of it. I don't care, as long as it's not resulting in a net flux of CO2 into the atmosphere, and they've got till 2050 to do it. And with possible exception of one, I won't name any names for fear of endorsements here, but it's the only one with a woman as CEO, no fossil fuel company in the world has a plan to actually get to net zero by 2050. So, we should be, rather than just saying that's an inconvenient fact and let's just sort of focus on other parts of the problem, focus on other parts of the problem by all means, but stay on those companies because there's not very many of them and they need to hear the same message from everybody.
And so I agree they need that message from everybody. Who is the responsible party for holding them to account? Is it governments? Is it suppliers? How do we make that really sink?
In the end, it has to be government because, I mean, you couldn't voluntarily buy sustainable aviation fuel today. You would just go out of business and your competitors would take over. So, on the other hand, a sort of a buyer's cartel, if you like, could actually have a lot of influence. If there was a clear demand for decarbonising fuel, it doesn't have to be fully decarbonised yet, but it has to be very clearly decarbonising between now and 2050, then I would imagine these companies would step up to it. They'd quote a price. In fact, they've told me they would, happily. But they say but there's no market for it. Well, why not?
Lazar, does that ring true for you in terms of your conversations with people who are trying to get on this journey? Do they?
It does, because let's face it, ESG isn't going to go away. Demand around carbon reduction isn't going to go away. And it is coming pretty much from everywhere. I agree with Myles that it does need to come from governments a lot more heavily, because some of these bigger players, they know in the end, are you not going to drive your car? Are you not going to take that plane to go to that event? Some people are starting to ask that question. And the more people ask those questions, the more they're going to feel the pressure. So it does absolutely ring true. And you are seeing some of the largest players in the oil and gas industries understand it and try to shift away from that. But I think the shift is way too slow.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to see if we've got any questions from the audience. Edward, have we got any questions via Slido?
We do indeed. We have a question on how do we manage potential consequences of decarbonisation, i.e. the use of SF6 in renewables, or does it still provide a step forward in decarbonisation?
SF6 sounds like one for you.
Yeah, I think for us, so we try several times to make initiatives, to work with clients, also to charter whole airplanes where we fly on sustainable fuels. I think there is often the problem today that it's made for client from a marketing perspective that you don't get 100%, of course, sustainable air fuels. It's probably 10%, 30%, so you just get a mixture. But I think the demand is actually, in my view, is there, that there are companies, also clients from us, who would love to fly completely or to distribute their medicine completely CO2 neutral, because it makes a sense for a pharma company who is there for the health of people, that they do it also on the climate side. Otherwise, it's long-term contradiction. In my view, it would help if clients, in our case, pharma companies, would have hard targets. That they say, yes, we want to have this amount of sustainable fuels, because that's the main polluter, is the aircraft fuels, need to be sustainable. And then if every supplier has these targets, then one can do it. I think that the tricky part is as one supplier alone, you don't have a chance. Yeah. Because another supplier, you're much more expensive than another supplier.
We're trying to do that at the NHS, trying to get them to have those targets. Yeah. Brilliant. Anything else on that point? I know there's definitely some hands coming up as well. Edward, anything else via Slido?
Nothing further on Slido. Any questions from the audience?
I've seen a couple. There's two here and one over there.
One there as well.
So, could you just tell us who you are? And
Okay, James Pilkington from the Zoological Society of London. 24% of greenhouse gas emissions come from agriculture, forestry, and other land use. And in addition, in contrast to the fossil fuel sector, these are not concentrated industries, right? These are like large numbers of smallholders and farmers scattered throughout the world. Do you guys have any thoughts about how companies higher up the supply chain can influence and reduce the emissions from this sector?
Lazar, do you want to take that first?
Yeah. Absolutely. Everybody shifts a lot of the blame on, airlines, airplane companies, anybody that uses fuel. But indeed, the agricultural sector is responsible for a big chunk of the emissions. Looking at, just reducing the amount of meat that you eat, obviously, is going to reduce that carbon footprint. Specifically to your question, though, I guess for me, the main thing is to try and eliminate waste in your day-to-day sort of in what you do on a daily basis as an organization. And if there are things that you can do less of, regardless of the sector, that will drive down those emissions. Agriculture is very specific because you're absolutely right. There's very small, it's a lot of small farmers that need to make small changes, or the cooperatives that need to drive those changes. And if the pressure continues to be the way that it is, it will happen. But it is more and more difficult when you have to really get to the individuals. I have to agree with you. The answer isn't ideal, but yeah, it's about making those tiny changes.
Yeah, Myles.
There is a big picture issue here, though, as well, which is that for net zero to last, it needs to be like-for-like net zero. We can't turn rocks into trees for very long. It's not a sustainable activity. And yet most companies' net zero plans, when you drill into them, amount to turning rocks into trees. So we need to stabilize, burning kerosene and planting trees. So we need to stabilize the carbon content of the biosphere, absolutely, which means we need, net zero food production. We also need net zero fossil fuel use. If we have any fossil fuel use left, which we probably will, past the time we need to get to net zero globally. I think it's often quite unhelpful to lose track of the fact that both of this is an and, not an either or. We can't balance, flying with veganism, nor can we balance an unsustainable food system with artificial air capture. Both have to get sorted out.
Yeah, a couple of more questions. Oh, there was one here. This is the second.
Thank you. Nick Daniel from Climate Partner. We are a climate action solution provider. And whilst we measure and reduce, we also do a large amount of offsetting and project development as well. I think we did 12 million tonnes last year, and there's 130 million globally. And I think a lot of our clients are seeing the price of carbon credits rise, which is a good thing in this space. But it does mean that they're finding it hard to still compensate for the emissions they're releasing today. And as we're talking about investment, I love the idea we need to do both if we can afford to, but what are your viewpoints on carbon offsetting and how do you see that being involved as part of the net zero conversation?
Good question. Anyone have a...
There's a lot of bad press on offsetting. I used to work for a company that was providing that. Then I went to the Carbon Trust, which is completely against it. Or maybe I shouldn't say that. Kind of on the fence, maybe. It has to be both. It has to, at this point in time, has to be both. You need to invest in the projects that are, if something's going to happen and you can find a way of doing it in a more responsible or sustainable way, then you should invest in that. And afterwards, get the offsets for it. So, because otherwise, I don't think we're going to meet those targets.
And I want you to keep delivering my medicines. And I want to stop causing climate change. So at the end of the day, offsetting is going to be part of the solution. But we've all got to have a vision of where we want to get to, which is like-for-like offsetting. So an effective offset for fossil kerosene being burnt in an aeroplane is active capture of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and re-injection underground. Anything else has a sort of level of temporariness to it, which might be useful for a decade or two, but we've got to recognize where we've got to get to. And I do think it would be really helpful if the offset industry as a whole acknowledged that. This is the destination, hard like-for-like offsetting by a certain date, and anything we do mixing things up between now and then maybe helping slow things down, but it's not going to get us to the solution unless we have a plan to get all the way there.
Yeah, we see it exactly this way. So at the moment, we don't have an alternative. We burn fuels. Even if technology-wise it will exist. So it's not a technology problem. It's really a scaling problem. But as long as it's not scaled, we are planting trees, which is temporary. Trees, again, die somewhere. But we need to plant huge amounts of trees. So I don't know the numbers by heart, but for one plane we charter, it's many, many trees if you fly once around the world. So you plant a whole forest, more or less, for one flight. So this one sees it's not a sustainable way it works to temporarily move it, but then technology change needs to come in long term.
Thank you. We've got a question here, patiently waiting over this gentleman with his hand up.
Should I take the mic over to him, or should I?
Oh, sorry, you have got it. We've got 4 minutes. We'll do them both, but we'll do you first, and then we'll come to you. We'll make sure we get both of you in.
Okay. I just wanted to say a little more on the agricultural subject that we were talking about before with the lovely question from the gentleman who works at the Zoological Society. My name's Arizona, and I have a organization called DIRT that works on soil regeneration globally as one of the most important things that we can do in the era of climate change. Agriculture, what's so interesting about it is that although it creates 24% of carbon emissions right now, it has the potential to sequester all the carbon in the atmosphere that we need to remove to get down to pre-industrial levels, which is not the case for all of those other 4 sectors that you were talking about, cement and probably the other 2 were, what were they?
Oil.
Gas and oil and mining and
Cool.
I think we may need to talk afterwards because I'm not sure that statistic is correct. And I was on the other side of the argument about Tom Crowther's paper, which I think has been generally regarded as factually incorrect. Agriculture can help, but the sum total of nature-based solutions potential based on the estimates from the nature-based solutions enthusiasts themselves is we might shave 1/10 of a degree off global temperatures by mid-century, perhaps 3/10 of a degree by the end of the century. Meanwhile, fossil fuels are driving up global temperatures by 2/10 of a degree per decade. So it can absolutely help, but it's not the solution.
And it would be great to incorporate as well the measurement on other things other than carbon, like biodiversity increase, water retention,
Of course,
absorption.
biodiversity, of course all these other things are important.
Because until we measure...
I'm a physicist,
now.
I'm just trying to stop global warming.
Oh, yeah. Everyone is. Everyone is.
In our
And I
last
care about
minute,
these other things too.
I want to make sure we get to this gentleman at the back because he's been patiently waiting. So thank you.
Hi, Nigel Edwards, Hilton Food Group. So I'm just going to add to that and say, as somebody in the meat, fish, and plant-based industries, the wider opportunities for sequestration, including the ocean, and particularly the methane balance. Myles, you're famous for this, so tell us a bit more about the methane balance.
Okay, not with the clock the way it is, but just to urge everybody to think about the implications of initiatives for temperature, and that's different from emissions. I'll leave you with that. We need all sectors to stop causing global warming. It's that simple.
Correct.
Well said. We've got about a minute left. I'd like to just thank the panel very much for all of your contributions. It's been a really interesting conversation, and I've really enjoyed it. I think it's given us a lot of food for thought. If I can just ask each one of you to give a sort of closing thought on the discussion to finish off. And Nico, if it's all right, I will go to you first. Just to anything you want to sort of leave the audience with in terms of getting us to net zero.
I think I'm completely on his view that it's basically very simple. We just need to stop burning. But then the problem is how we incentivize it, that we can do it. Because we are burning, and we don't want to burn, but we still do it. So day by day, a huge amount of tons. And in my view, to solve this problem, it really helps with hard targets. Someone says this is a target, because then suppliers like us have to meet this target. This gets more pressure down, so we can build up pressure through the whole chain. I think that's one possibility of bringing from top down, or the other possibility, like you said, that we start at the source. But I have a feeling the top-down approach is probably easier, that all the clients say we want to have net zero, and all our suppliers should do it, so we can then start it this way around. That would help us a lot.
Great, thanks. Myles?
I mean, it is simple. It is also achievable, and that's the main message I'd like you to remember. Completely decarbonising vehicle fuels would add about 50 pence to the cost of a litre of petrol. That means capturing the carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, re-injecting it back underground. The same for natural gas would add about £1 a megawatt hour. I'm always confused with units of natural gas. In both cases, it's less than the prices varied over the past 6 months. In the case of natural gas, less than the prices varied over the past 2 weeks. And we got 30 years to do it. This is an absolutely solvable problem. But we've got to start thinking about it in terms of how do we get net zero stuff, not net zero systems. We need every bit of stuff we use to be consistent with net zero. That's the main message I want you to take away in thinking about your supply chains. If you're holding something, is its production, is its use, is its disposal consistent with a net zero world? And if it isn't, who do you need to go and talk to make it so?
Thank you. And Lazar?
Good point. Very good point. So 30 years to do it, in which case engage so that you can measure so that you can reduce, and then offset. I think that's all.
Okay, words of wisdom. Thank you all for your attention, and thank you so much to the panel. Really appreciate your contribution.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.